Good afternoon, or rather good evening, everybody. I'm Ann Applebaum. I run the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute. This is we're describing it internally as a pop-up event. It was conceived earlier this week in response to the extraordinary news of the last few days. Although in some ways it's a continuation of other things we've done here. One of our panelists is Peter Pomerantsev, who is a broadcaster and journalist, an excellent writer about Russia, and he's also the author of a really superb paper that we published a few months ago called Russia, a Postmodern Dictatorship. Not long, just before that, we also published another paper by Ben Judah called 5 Traps for Putin. So in some ways, this is a continuation of things we've done before. The panel this evening has different kinds of expertise across the region, so we're not going to do the BBC television thing of having a staged argument and trying to come up with opposite views. Instead, what I'm going to try and do is elicit some of the, some of the knowledge of the people on the panels, and then let you draw conclusions. We will go until 6:15 exactly. I will at some points ask for questions. In the first part, we're going to divide it up a little bit because there's a whole range of possible topics. I think in the first part we'll concentrate on Kiev and what's happening there now, and what what we can expect from the new government there, and then we'll move on to the geopolitics and some of the broader questions in the region. As I say, we have views about those here. So as I said, one of our to my right, I don't think in any sense politically or otherwise, is Peter Pomerantsev, who's a journalist and broadcaster and author of really great recent writing on Russia and Ukraine. Orysia Lutsevych is a research fellow at Chatham House. She's also the author of a really superb paper on NGOs and on civil society in Ukraine that was published a few months ago. You can find it on the Chatham House website. And then down at the end is Edward Lucas, who I've known for 25 years, since he was the correspondent in Prague in 1989. And he is the author of multiple books on this subject. Probably the most pertinent one is one of the older ones called The New Cold War. So if you want to ask the question, is this a Cold War, he's the guy who can answer it. So as I said, we'll start with Ukraine and then move outwards, as it were. And I'm going to start with Orysia because this is really her area of expertise. And can you paint for us a little bit right now? We're seeing a lot of different things happening on the news. Can you tell us a little bit, because you've been studying it, how people in Kiev perceive these events, first of all, and then second, can you enlighten us about the nature of the new government and the nature of the new group of people running the country? Why don't you start?
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, Legatum, for inviting. You mentioned the paper which was entitled How to Finish Revolution, so I should be careful next time I write papers, what I wish for. But in a way, events that we have seen unfolding in Kiev since almost 4 months ago is in a way an unfinished business of the revolution of 2004, where we've seen some of the leadership changed as a result of a popular protest, but the systems remain the same. So right now, when we are talking about the new government that was appointed, was voted in the parliament by an overwhelming majority, I think this is one of the highest level of confidence that the parliament has given to any government in Ukraine, with 331 votes out of 450, with a lot of members of parliament from the Party of Regions missing. So,
and this is the elected parliament, so
right.
This is a legitimate government.
Exactly. The parliament was elected, and before this, in a way, stepping forward, one of the key questions right now that we hear also asked in the West with some experts, but mostly, the claim that Russia has that this government is not, they don't recognize authorities of Kiev as legitimate. I've been carefully following the debate in the parliament, the very moment when they were adopting the resolution on ousting President Yanukovych from office. And basically, they were referring to him violating the deal that was signed the day before in his office, that gave him 48 hours to adopt a new constitution, and they already knew that he fled the capital, that none of the documents that were approved in the parliament on the Constitutional Act would be signed and not printed in papers, which means that this deal on the constitution would not be signed. So this team of new Ukrainian government, a lot of in Ukraine say is one of the best that Ukraine has ever seen. It's a mix of people, but what is striking is also the high presence of people from around the current Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. The core of the government is coming from his previous party before the merger with the party Batькivщина, with at that time imprisoned Yulia Tymoshenko. So this is really people that he can trust, and it shows in a way that he has a pool of human resources that can reform Ukraine. The government has very few members of government who held any ministerial post before, and it's very striking, has a lot of civil society leaders and activists. 6 posts were given, very key ones, on fighting corruption, on illustration, cleaning up the systems. Minister of Economy is a very capable expert, former advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. So in a way, this government is a pro-reform government, pro-European government, and clearly when I was looking at the program that they pronounced in the parliament before the vote, number one, of course, priority is stability and security. We all know why, and we'll talk about it later. Number 2 is signing an association agreement. This is something we should not forget why people went on the streets. They went on the streets to put European future back on the agenda, and all kinds of reforms and changes that come from this association agreement. Clearly, priority number 1 is economics. These priorities, I would not even say 1, 2, 3, they're all big number 1 priorities. And we already see that they started cooperation with the IMF and are moving on building the assistance package from a mixture of loans, grants, and other guarantees that will help Ukrainian economy somehow to survive. But, you know, of course, there was a sudden relief, right, once this government was appointed, and even, you know, the hope that they will deliver some of this decentralization and change that Ukrainians want. I was looking at the recent opinion polls, and the priorities of splitting the power, splitting the dictatorship of Yanukovych between the parliament and the executive are supported at large by Ukrainians. The government is trying to be inclusive by having some of the ministers coming from Crimea, for example, like Minister of Social Policy and Labor. She's from Crimea. But suddenly, of course, or not so suddenly, now we understand that this Operation Crimea was planned before. This all put very different priority to what the government, rather than being proactive and pro-reform and trying to build on economic priorities, now has to deal with very serious security implications. And some of the issues that are evolving right now in Ukraine with these instigated separatist movements, some of these pro-Russian protests that we see, in a way it's like an export of separatism in Ukraine from Russia. I mean, we all know there are different feelings. That some are pro-Russian, but in Ukraine, if you look at some of the statistics, even in Crimea, and this poll was just released in March of this year, only 41% support Crimea being part of Russia. And that's, you know, if you have some kind of a debate, if you have a free media, and if you have give opportunity to citizens of Crimea to think about implications of changing their legal status, only 41 say they want it. In Donetsk, for example, only 33 support being part of Russia. So there's a lot of speculation on this to bring, of course, political dividends. In Ukraine, in terms of territorial system, now we hear a lot of federation proposal, especially coming from Russia, as the way to, you know, let's finish this Cold War business, let's create Ukraine a federal state. And for example, even before the crisis, only 6% of Ukrainians see federation on the horizon as anything they would like to discuss. Ukrainians themselves do not see federal system as something that would solve their economic problem, the problem of corruption, even the problem of relations with Russia. So in a way, a lot of this separatist and federalism moves.
It's a distraction from the things that people are interested in.
It's description. It's like a Russian language issue, something that is used very often in a political speculation, but it's number 10 priority in Ukraine if you ask people what are their issues and what they worry about. So in a way, to wrap up, because I know we have lots of grounds to cover, I think that right now new Ukrainian government has to really fill in any vacuum of power that exists and to really reach out to the eastern parts of Ukraine and to Crimea, which is becoming increasingly difficult because of the access of media is being blocked. Even the OSCE unarmed mission was returned today from Crimea. But I think having an envoy from Kiev who would try to reach out, perhaps Mr. Poroshenko, who may have some trust, to explain that these nightmares that are being presented to Crimeans through Russian media, and even I've heard from people walking on the streets, saying if these Ukrainians will come they will just do a pogrom here in Crimea and you will all die, so we're here to protect you. It's an outrageous speculation and propaganda which should be confronted by the authorities in Kiev, and hopefully they will be able to pull out this whole debate in some kind of legislative and legitimate field, because right now everything that's happening in Crimea from A to Z is illegitimate.
Edward, you've been writing about transitions in Russia and in Eastern Europe for 2 decades. This moment of transition in Ukraine is a very odd one. Can you talk a little bit about the economic and political context? What kind of success can it have?
I think there's 3 strands to this crisis. There's the economic financial one, there's the political constitutional one, and there's the geopolitical one. And any one of those on its own would be an enormous front page story deserving all our attention. A big country that's in this kind of financial mess is an international economic emergency. It's perfectly copable with, but that alone, restructuring the debt, getting an IMF program in place, working out the energy, how to reform the energy sector and so on, would be huge. The constitutional crisis, where you've got really no really legitimate organs of power, I slightly disagree with Orysia, because if you remember the circumstances in which this Rada was elected, they were pretty suboptimal. I mean, a lot of people were there having paid money to get into the Rada because they wanted to exploit that position for it. So you're dealing with a political class, the existing political class, which is pretty substantially discredited. And I don't completely share Orysia's optimism. I think there are some excellent members of the new government, and that's very encouraging. When I see someone like Mr. Prodan, for example, and recall his role in the energy sector in the past, I'm less encouraged. But I think it's really important we start the debate on Ukraine. There's a big problem in all our discussions about this, that we start off talking about Putin and what deal can we do to put Putin back in his box, and maybe if we give him this and we give that stick and this carrot and so on. We have to start with Ukraine as a country. Ukraine as a country, Ukrainians as a people, whatever their native language, whatever their cultural and historical views, they have to be in the center of the discussion. Ukraine is a subject, not an object of this. And unfortunately, this geopolitical context makes solving the other 2 things really, really difficult. And we'll get onto that in the second part of the discussion. But I think our expectations should be very modest. We should not expect miracles from this interim government. And if we manage to get any kind of elections, which may not be able to take place across the whole territory of Ukraine, whatever government takes shape afterwards, again, our expectation should be very realistic. I think I absolutely endorse the idea that the quick fix involves some kind of constitutional gimmick. Let's make Ukraine into a confederation and then it'll be okay. Absolutely not. The idea that you start off by rejigging the constitution to give Crimea more autonomy or something like that, I think is entirely misconceived. It would work fine if we were dealing with Switzerland, because you don't have Germany and France trying to bite chunks out of Switzerland. You cannot, I think, address any sort of constitutional reform when you've got a predatory neighbour behaving the way that Russia does. It's a precondition for any discussion about a future constitutional settlement, which I don't think should be a priority even then, that you're not under threat from Russia. And my final point is I think we must always bear in mind when we're talking about Ukrainian politics that huge amounts of money are at stake. Over the past 15, 20 years, money has been the kind of huge hidden factor in Ukrainian politics. We've seen oligarchs setting up political parties, shamelessly buying and selling political influence, creating and extracting rents, particularly in the energy sector. And it's been very corrosive, not just because corruption is bad in politics, but because those oligarchs' businesses have been largely based on doing business with Russia, and this has funneled Russian corruption and Russian money directly into Ukrainian politics with lamentable results. I think that we need to keep our eye very much on the ball as far as the oligarchs are concerned.
Is this an unravelable problem? I mean, are there measures you could put in Ukraine?
Yeah, there's one very simple measure, which should be the number one condition when the EU or IMF is talking to Ukraine, which is to please put some gas meters on the pipeline on the Ukrainian-Russian border. If you imagine, Ukraine is a bit like a supermarket, where for reasons of their own, the owners of the supermarket don't actually check the invoices when stuff is delivered. So bread arrives in the supermarket and invoices are paid to bread suppliers, but no one actually counts the loaves. That's the way the Ukrainian gas industry works. There is a loaf counting mechanism, but it's in the bakery, not in the supermarket. So the meter is somewhere inside Russia. And then second, the bread is sold within the supermarket at different prices depending on your political connections with the manager. So I think that the energy import, the gas import business is the kind of dark heart of the Ukrainian political and economic system.
And are they ready to tackle that?
Well, if not now, then when? And if not this government, then who? I mean, starting off by metering, Ukraine has promised on countless occasions to install those meters, and they've never been done. It's a bit like land reform in Greece. It's always promised, and I mean land registration, the cadastre in Greece, always promised, not done. This will be a number one sign of good faith from this government if they do it, because once you do that, you can then start saying, okay, what's the energy debt? How do we reschedule it? What should you default on? But until that simple thing of actually measuring the energy, the gas that comes in is done, everything else is just pie in the sky.
Mm-hmm. Peter, you watch media in Russia and in Ukraine.
Well,
and you also once described yourself to me as sort of Ukrainian. So.
Yeah, after this crisis, I am definitely Ukrainian. I actually just realized that I am somewhere. A couple of days ago at 4 in the morning, I woke up going, my God, I was born in Kiev. And a friend of mine has a scarf, a Ukrainian scarf they brought from Maidan, which I need to pick up. This is actually one of the side effects, the positive side effects of this crisis is that suddenly Putin is almost in this bizarre psychoanalytical process fathering a sort of Ukrainian nationalism for people who were uncertain of it. But one of the things I'll just add very quickly about Ukraine, I've actually been, trying to write about the crisis a little bit, but also looking at the way it's being written about. And we really need to, as a sort of media community, learn to start talking about Ukraine, because there's sort of the lack of knowledge and lack of correspondence there has been shocking. There's been two memes that I've picked, I'll just focus on, which I think have been very, very damaging and have really given a very distorted understanding in Western perceptions about Ukraine. The first is a language one. All the time, the Washington Post, Sky, they put up this nice little map. Red bit of Ukraine in east speaks Russian. Green bit in the west speaks Ukrainian. And I mean, if anybody here, a lot of people here do know Ukraine, you'll know it's a multilingual country. It's normal for people to be multilingual. You'll be on the street, one person will start in Russian, flip to Ukrainian, say something else in Surzhyk, which is this own language that they have, this weird pidgin Russian Ukrainian. And
International Slavonic.
International Slavonic with bits of Polish and Yiddish and all sprinkled in. I think part of the problem is ignorance, and part of the problem is that a lot of journalists come from a monolingual society. They can't imagine a multilingual society as normal. Yeah. And they've developed this bizarre ethno-linguistic map, which has very little to do with society. Odessans hate people from Donetsk, because anybody, in Ukraine knows.
And they both speak Russian.
And they both speak Russian, exactly. So it's a very regionalized country. It is actually a country that might want a federalized system, but it's not a Russian-Ukrainian divide. The second one, which is a much more damaging sort of meme that's come up in both the left-wing and the right-wing press, is that Ukraine doesn't really exist. It's something that you expect from Putin, but I saw it the other day in a very, very trendy left-wing magazine. It comes out all the time from lots of places, mainly partly because a lot of the correspondents writing about Ukraine are actually Moscow correspondents, and they've been infected with the Moscow vision of Ukraine, which said it's not a real country, it doesn't actually exist. This really came through, I think, during the first round of violence. I don't know if you remember, there were a lot of the avant-garde, very violent avant-garde, were throwing Molotov cocktails at police. And they were doing this on a street called Khrushchevsky Street. And I kept on waiting for some journalists to write a really banal phrase like, they're fighting for Ukrainian identity on the street named after the man who sort of invented the Ukrainian idea. And no one wrote about it. And I realized they had no idea who Khrushchevsky is. Yeah. And I know there are correspondents at the moment doing their wiki searches.
Maybe you should explain.
Who Khrushchevsky was the father of Ukrainian nationalism, the whole Ukrainian project. So the fact that they were fighting on a street is the sort of banality that is always mentioned by journalists. And I really think that we have journalists who write about Ukraine have no idea who Khrushchevsky is, have no idea who Bandera is, have no idea of contemporary Ukrainian literature, have no idea of really this very, very difficult, interesting, fascinating journey towards nationhood that Ukraine is taking. And it's always just like, it doesn't exist. It's an accidental country. Complete and utter ignorance of an incredibly interesting space, which is in a very difficult but very active and very productive course of sort of gaining an identity. So what next, very briefly? I'd say we know when the situation there has changed, when either Kiev has its own correspondent or Kiev is covered by the European correspondent, not the Moscow correspondent. That'll be a huge step forward, I think.
Right, thank you. Is there anybody who would like to make a comment or ask a question at this point on these issues, on the issues directly to do with Ukraine? No. Dennis McShane.
Has Putin lost Kiev? I mean, has he?
Putin later.
Chief of Russia in several hundred years to actually disconnect Russia from Kiev like forever. Is Crimea a fair exchange for having lost Kiev? It seems to be a terrible.
That implies that Kiev belongs to Putin in the first place. That reminds me of this incredibly. No disrespect, Dennis, but I mean, I hear echoes in this of that debate in America of who lost Russia, as if Russia was. I think. I mean, Kiev has been a capital city since 1991, and I don't think at any point since 1991 it's really been possible to say it was in the grip or gift of a Russian leader. I think that the Putin regime's stock is very low in Kiev because they've seen what he's done. But I think this won and lost.
But isn't the implication of that question is, are Russian actions likely to increase whatever the strength of Ukrainian national identity? I mean, as you said, are people going to run out and get their orange scarves?
It already does. I think Putin already united Ukrainian nation back half a year ago when he was putting all the economic pressure on the border by forbidding Ukrainian pork, chocolate, cheese, whatnot. And in a way, people started seeing a real face of Putin, right? Maybe not everybody saw it before, but through his spokesman Glaziev in particularly, who was treating Ukrainian nation with outrageous disrespect, a lot of Ukrainians say, hold on, we don't want to be treated like that, and in a way, even now with the invasion in Crimea, you should not forget that Ukraine is under general mobilization. It's a very serious situation, Ukraine is both traumatized by the event, by deaths of hundreds of people that Ukrainian nation has never seen. And then suddenly this is like another wave of this very dramatic events that are evolving. And Putin is losing, and not only Kiev, he's losing in a way his east is any kind of support, including in Crimea.
Can I add to that?
And then we'll take it.
Yeah, Putin, yes, but Putin's lost Moscow as well. He's lost lots of places. So at the end of the day, and this is the ridiculousness of what Putin is doing, Ukraine will never go very far away from Russia for so many historical, geographical, economic reasons. So no, if another leader comes in later who's not so aggressive and vile, no, I think Kiev will be just as warm towards Moscow and St. Petersburg. There are so many connections. There's 20 trains a day. Come on, we all live in that kind of. The ties are so deep. I don't think Putin can actually ruin them.
Another comment before we go on to Putin.
I want to ask a question. You mentioned that now it's obvious that this invasion was planned ahead of time. I'd just like to hear a little bit more information about that, about when this was planned, how we know it was planned ahead of time. And the other thing is the kinds of, because there hasn't been much news coverage on it, the kind of propaganda or news coverage that people in Crimea are getting now. I guess they're just getting Russian TV. I hadn't really thought about it before, but if you could talk about.
Okay, well, those are two separate questions. Is there anybody? No, we're getting to that.
Are you going to be discussing later the history, or is this a good time to ask about that?
History of.
How long have you got?
Well, I mean, no, because I'm just, to what extent we should look into Russians' view of Ukraine and what they call the Great Patriotic War, or Ukrainians' view of Russia in respect to the famines of the 1920s and the 1930s, or what sort of person was Bandera? Was he objectively Nazi? Was he just a good patriot? I mean, I'm interested in your explanation of how history is playing both in Ukraine among Ukrainians and in Russia among Russians.
Okay, let's splice some of those questions. Why don't we talk a little bit first about history, and then we can talk about Putin.
I think everybody in this room should read the collected works of Timothy Snyder of Yale University, and particularly his recent articles in the New York Review of Books and elsewhere. I've tweeted them all on my Twitter feed, but I think Snyder brilliantly explains the kind of clashing, the myths and myth making that are involved in this. And I think that there's a huge danger. I mean, stating on what Peter's just said, I think the kind of official Russian view is that only the Russian view of history is correct, and anybody who disagrees with it is a Nazi. And large chunks of history are left out. Some have sort of flipped from black to white. So Stalin becomes Hitler's opponent rather than initially his friend and ally. And over again, the Ukrainians pay with blood in enormous quantities. They were victims of the artificial famine. They were victims of the Nazis. They then played a very large role in the Soviet army that conquered Nazi Germany. But I think it's such a huge subject. I hesitate to try and say anything definitive here, except just to say, please read Timothy Snyder's books.
Yeah, I would also say, and speaking as a historian sometimes in the region.
And Applebaum's books as well.
I think as a historian of the region, in a weird way, although it kills me to say this, there's a weird way in which I don't think what's going on now has that much to do with history in that sense. I mean, yes, it's true there is a memory of the Ukrainian famine, and that is a part of Ukrainian national identity. And yes, it's true that there have been conflicts, over the city of Kiev before or between. But I really feel that right now what's happening is not about history. And most of even the people who are called extremists or right-wing, there's nothing Nazi about them. There's nothing that's got anything to do with Hitler or the 1930s. This is really a conflict that's about what kind of country Ukraine is going to be now and what's going to be the nature of the political system. And there are some people who have reasons why they would prefer an authoritarian system or an oligarchic economic system. They feel safe the way they are. They would like to keep them the same. And then there are people who would like to see something more like what they imagine Europe to be, something more democratic, based on the rule of law, with a decent judicial system. And that seems to me, that's really the fundamental conflict right now. It's not really about old categories and trying to apply categories from the past onto the current situation, I really think distorts it.
That's very dangerous, because I think that's what Putin precisely is doing by trying to resonate these cliches that some fears. It's basically
the word
scare,
Nazi has no role in this conversation. There's nothing. There are no Nazis there of any significance.
And that's specifically the Soviet style, isn't it? That any enemy is Nazi, and the show trials are always about these imaginary Nazis.
If if I may just share a small observation, I was in Donetsk in September, which is the east, in the east, and there was a celebration of the liberation from the Nazis in the city, the anniversary, and there was a concert with the popular singers, and the DJ was saying that, you know, we should be worried for this European Union because these Germans, they will come back. So, you know, we've seen, this is speculation that was very, you know, very much abused by political parties in the East to scare people.
With UKIP, actually.
Yeah, so you know what we're talking about.
So why don't you say something and then we'll move on to
Very, very briefly, yes. I think about history, I completely agree with Anne. If we're looking at the Ukrainian project, it is a project that is coming into being. We're actually seeing in front of our eyes a nation working out what its idea of history and idea of the self is. So about Bandera, everyone knows who he is. He was a sort of certainly right-wing but nationalist leader in the 1930s who might have sometimes collaborated with Hitler. He certainly has
but also
sometimes.
worked for MI6.
MI6 and also fought Stalin. So it's not actually who he was that's that important. It's all about what Ukrainians now make of it. We could focus on Churchill as, you know, a man who sort of ran concentration camps in South Africa, or as the man who fought Hitler. There are different bits. We're talking about a country that's creating its idea of self. It's a forward-looking project. And just very quickly about Russia, the great paradox when Russians say Ukraine isn't a real country, they've got it the wrong way around. It's Russia who hasn't worked out what sort of country it is, where its borders are, whether it's an empire, whether it's a federation, whether it's just a wreck.
Yeah,
Ukrainian, we do know what it is. It's a forward-thinking European, Eastern European project with Ukrainian language as a key component of that nation building.
And I'll just say as a final thing, I mean, one of the other complications is, you know, Crimea itself. Crimea itself was conquered by the Russians at the end of the 18th century. Its population was deported more than once, actually, but most recently by Stalin in the middle of the 20th century. You know, Russia's right to Crimea or its ownership of Crimea is actually very complicated. I mean, it's a little bit like to say that Britain owns Ireland or has a right to Ireland. Yes, Britain conquered Ireland at one point, and then eventually Ireland became independent. So it's a, you know, these are shifting categories, and they can be used by politicians. The three of us agreed, or the four of us agreed beforehand that we would have a piece of this conversation in which we all got to say, we spoke a little bit about Putin, what exactly Putin thinks he's gaining by this, how does this fit into the longer narrative of his years in power, why has he chosen to use this moment to use force in Ukraine? And I'll start with Edward on
Good.
Putin.
I think that there isn't a grand design of Putinism. I don't think Putin arrived in the Kremlin and said, right, I'll be nice for a few years and then I'm going to start kicking up a fuss. I think the essential point about the Putinite or Putinist foreign policy is it's quite opportunistic. When he sees weakness, he advances. When he sees resistance, he retreats.
Not unlike Stalin, but I didn't say that.
I mean, a lot of political leaders are like that. But there's, so it's opportunistic, and he is driven. I think there's a desire to redress what he sees as a great historical injustice, which is the fall of the Soviet Empire, notoriously described by him as a geopolitical catastrophe. And I think he feels that history owes Russia. Russia should get something back. And part of that is a kind of Russia's status as a global power. Part of it is Russia's security as he sees it in its front and back yards. And there's a very useful little joke, which is that the Russian definition of a secure frontier is one with Russian soldiers on both sides. Used to be said of the Soviet Union. And that's, we tend to look at security in terms of cooperation and win-win situations where people pool sovereignty, get together, and everybody's better result. That's not the way he sees it, and we're deluding ourselves if we do. You might think that it would be a sensible thing for Russia to have Ukraine as a strong, prosperous, secure neighbour, as Poland is. Poland is an ideal neighbour for Russia. It's a very, very good trading partner and very friendly country in all sorts of ways. But he doesn't want Ukraine to be a giant Poland. An outcome that would be worse for Russia in objective terms is better for him in subjective ones.
But why?
I think he doesn't like, well, as I said, he wants to weaken the West. He doesn't like the way the world works. He doesn't like the West's role in it. And he sees weakness, and he's right to see weakness, I'm afraid, at the moment. He pretty much got away with the Georgian war. He pretty much got away with the cyber attack on Estonia. He's got away with quite a lot of things. And I think he feels he's getting away with this too. I think his initial policy in Ukraine was pretty unsuccessful. He thought that he would force a confrontation over force a choice over the issue of the European Union. That was an entirely artificial conflict. There was no reason why Russia couldn't be quite happy with Ukraine having a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. It would be part of making Ukraine a better neighbour for Russia. He forced that choice. He waged economic warfare with the trade sanctions so on, in flagrant defiance of all sorts of WTO and other commitments, and got very little pushback from the West. Interesting contrast, incidentally, to when he tried economic warfare against Poland in, I think, 2007, and Angela Merkel, in one of her first acts as German Chancellor, went to the Samara summit with the EU and said, you screw with Poland, you screw with Germany. And that was a big wake-up call for Putin. He hasn't really waged economic warfare.
It was also his first understanding of what the EU was.
Exactly.
Because he dismissed it. It's like the UN. It's another international organization.
So he tried the same tactic against Ukraine, and there was no pushback, really. And he thought, good, this is working. There were then some protests. He said to Yanukovych, crack down on the protests. Big misjudgment. Yanukovych wasn't up to it, and in the end, ran away. Getting Crimea is I wouldn't say a consolation prize, but it's a kind of double or quits, really. He didn't get the big prize of Ukraine in the Eurasian Economic Union. At least Crimea is something that he can take away. And it also sets a very important precedent. If he gets away with this, he's established the idea that Russia can interfere in the rights of in neighbouring countries on behalf, as he would say, of the compatriots there. Incredibly dangerous language, the on behalf of and the compatriot. The definition of compatriot really deserves a book. It basically means anyone who has got any connection with the former Soviet Union. So I think the big nightmare for me in this is not just what happens to Ukraine, and Ukraine may become a kind of failed state and ungovernable and bitter and radicalized, and all the economic dislocation and refugees and all the other bad things that could happen from a big country going to sort of permanent dysfunction in the middle of Europe. The real nightmare for me in this is that it moves to the Baltic states. Because I think if Putin senses weakness, he will then say, I've got a chance to bust NATO now. I will do something to the Baltic states which is damaging and humiliating and stops short of warfare. And NATO, in the end, will not do anything. There will be kind of vague Article 4 consultations, expressions of grave concern, a few taken sanctions, and I would have done something really nasty to Estonia and Latvia on the ethnic Russians, or to Lithuania on the corridor to Kaliningrad. And I think actually that calculation is wrong. I think NATO would react very strongly, properly. But we will be in a position where we either let Putin bust NATO, or we're going for the most serious confrontation we've had in Europe in 50 years. And that's a horrible position for us to be in. And
yeah, I have a slightly different view. I mean, I think at least some of this, and I would like to know what Peter thinks about it, I think some of what we've seen Putin do in the last few days and weeks has also been to do with domestic politics. I mean, I think Putin himself has fears or anxieties about his own legitimacy.
Yeah.
He's faced down demonstrations in Moscow before. And to him, you know, the specter of even if it's a democratic-ish, European-ish, free-ish market Ukraine is very threatening because it threatens it undermines the nature of the regime he has created, which is autocratic and oligarchic and fundamentally untransparent. We don't really know how Russian money works or how Russian power works.
Absolutely.
And if an alternate system was to develop in Ukraine, which is the closest nation culturally and historically to Russia and the whole region, that's a challenge to Putin and to his system. And I suspect we're focusing this. We use Putin as a shorthand, but actually we're talking about a group of people. The Russian elite is larger than just Putin, and this is a threat to all of them, and to their money, and to their position, and to the system that they built. What do you think? No.
Listen, it's obviously a sort of axiomatic thought that wars boost your ratings at home, and I think that Putin's shot up to 72%. It's the highest that it's been for a very long time now. Even the Moscow intelligentsia started writing nationalist pamphlets. Yeah, of course, that always works. Putin, since 2011, has been trying to build up an ideology or sort of a state state kind of a state dictated ideology, which isn't really working. There's a lot of noise about the sort of the new conservatism. Nobody really buys it. It's an incredibly unconservative culture, this is sort of like an action that unites a patriotic bloc around him. It'll be easier to identify enemies and traitors in our midst. So yes, wars do all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things for your standing at home. A small victorious war, I think they called it, about Chechnya, and that kind of got out of control. So that's the danger of that strategy.
How does Putin look from Kiev? Has the interpretation of him shifted?
Well, you know, from the very beginning, if you look at the slogans that people were carrying on the first protest, they were saying, Putin, hands off Ukraine. Ukrainians understood the end game that, you know, Yanukovych was playing his game mainly by trying to remain in power, in office, keeping his little oligarchic empire and all his villas that we now see. And not only him, again, it's not just Yanukovych, it's the clan of the family and all the prosecutors general around him that were benefiting hugely. I think that the danger was obvious from the very beginning that Putin has a role to play. But I think also I agree to your point of a very much also internally driven response because of all the Russian propaganda about what this was in Ukraine that was happening. Now, for internal Russian audience, they have to say that, you know, a people power doesn't exist. You know, we in Kremlin they still have this orange revolution, you know, paranoia in a way of they don't want anything like that repeating. Especially, perhaps thinking that this may be a success, that maybe they will pull together a team that is capable of delivering reforms.
A successful Ukraine
is a threat in a way of giving a very powerful message to Russians, thinking why wouldn't this be possible in Russia, in Belarus, in Armenia, in other places around. So this has a wider regional implication. A lot of people will be following very closely, but also something that I think the Crimean hook can play very nicely with whoever will be a future presidential leader, you know, or presidential candidate or trying to run. And I was, you know, we didn't mention the name Ms. Tymoshenko yet, but you may have noticed in the media immediately after her release, Russians said she may be a very capable, you know, prime minister for Ukraine. And they've been quite disappointed with the way Yanukovych was handling the crisis. So we don't know how the position on Russia, of Russia on Crimea will sway or change depending on the prospects of who may be the next president of Ukraine. And I was looking at the data today. The number one rating so far is taken by Mr. Petro Poroshenko, over 21%, then followed by
for the potential next president.
Yes, in the May 25th run-up of elections, and there's quite a gap with the former boxer Vitaly Klitschko, who now takes 15%, and Ms. Tymoshenko around 12%. So very interesting to watch how this will play in the Crimea story.
And the Russia's attitude towards Ukraine will depend on whether they think there's somebody they can deal with in charge of the country.
And what kind of bonus they may give to this potential candidate to claim some kind of solution of a crisis with Russia over Crimea.
Any comments about Putinism, Russia? Sorry, there's one here and then one there. So, why don't you say your name? I've been failing to ask for that.
I'm Yari Krivoy, Belarus Digest. I wonder what kind of implications the recent invasion of Putin into Crimea will have on Russian integration projects, on Belarus, on Kazakhstan, because I guess the leaders are quite scared that, you know, with a sizable Russian-speaking population in both countries, that Russia at some point can do, you know, the same to their countries. And the other question, can Russia actually afford feeding Crimea, you know, getting this new chunk of land, and will it not, you know, be too much for the empire?
Well, let's take a couple more.
Yeah, let's take several questions.
Yeah, let's take several questions. Right there. So.
Garvin Walsh from Conservative Home. There's been a lot of talk here about, you know, Putin's perception of the West's weakness, and Western governments, whether it's the leaked memo going into Downing Street or some German politicians openly and officially have been talking a lot about the role of Russian money, and basically saying, you know, we're weak because we want their money. And is this a conscious strategy, or is it just a happy accident for Putin?
One more over here.
Daniel Beer, University of London. I'm slightly perplexed by the absence of the Russians in the plural in this conversation. I mean, when we talk about Russia, we just seem to be talking about Putin, and to say that his popularity ratings have shot through the roof is another way of saying that this is these measures are extremely popular with large numbers of Russians. I mean, there may be complicated reasons why they are duped or misled or manipulated, but it seems to me that there's a way in which Putin is responding to the growth of an ethno-nationalism within Russia itself, and that to be seen to be abandoning ethnic Russians abroad would carry a political price at home. That there have been, there have been political parties on the far right like Milonov, but also groups around Navalny who've been promoting an ethnic, which would be disastrous, I think, for the Russian Federation if it really took hold. But I think that this can be seen in terms of domestic politics as operating also from a position of relative weakness. That he's behind the political agenda rather than setting it.
Well, there was a range of questions there. Why don't you, Edward? Do you want to take on the role of Russian money or nationalism?
Kazakhstan stunningly unenthused by this, and I think it's a really.
So this is a question. This is the answer to the question about the wider region.
Yeah, I think this is a really bad move for the Eurasian project because it puts Russian ethnicity ahead of anything else, and so it's really worrying for the Kazakhs. And I haven't noticed brotherly Belarus being particularly enthusiastic about it either. Though maybe you ought to be able to correct me. And I think it's also dangerous at home because if you run a multi-ethnic country, once you start saying that the ethnos is more important than the demos, it's extremely dangerous. And Paul Goebel, who I strongly recommend if people don't follow him, has been writing about how this is going down with. They sent some Tatars from Tatarstan down to Crimea to try and work on the Crimean Tatars, and the Crimean Tatars managed to radicalize the Tatars, the Tatars from Tatarstan, who then went back to Tatarstan and said, all this sucks and Russian imperialism is very, 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 very bad. Can he afford it? Yes, he can. I mean, he's not running the country in the interest of its people. There's plenty of money around for this sort of stuff. And on the role of Russian money, I think this has been a deliberate policy by the Kremlin, and they have bought large chunks of the industry and financial sector in a whole range of countries. And we may laugh at Cyprus because of the way Russian money's penetrated the financial system, but just look at the City of London, look at the Austrians, look at all sorts of places. So I think the way in which BP is now so dependent on its shareholding in Rosneft, and BP is the company that probably pays most of the pensions of most of the people here. It's very important for the government that BP doesn't go down the tubes. And if BP gets into trouble in Russia, which can be very easily arranged by one phone call from Mr. Putin to Mr. Sechin, and they probably talk several times a day, and Rosneft suddenly says to BP, oh dear, we've got a problem, and BP goes howling to Downing Street and says, please don't kick up a fuss with Russia. And that's why I renamed BP and the Economist recently as Britneft, and they didn't like it very much.
Orysia, do you want to? You don't have to answer all of those. One piece
Sorry.
of it. Yeah.
Well, basically, I mean, we should also keep in mind that Russian economy is not doing so well in a way also, and the growth that is needed so much, because this year projection is at 0, and the growth so much will not be fueled by the monetary injection in the Russian economy coming from the reserve, but also from Russian economists and people in banking saying they desperately need investments. So in one way, yes, of course, I'm sure Putin can afford paying 6 billion to Crimea out of his 500 billion, reserves. But I mean, the question is how long this is going to last, and how. I mean, and this is the territory that is economically not doing so well as even compared to other parts of Ukraine. Depends on water from Ukraine. Was hugely dependent on tourism, which obviously now perhaps there will be some tourism going to watch Russian soldiers from the West. I don't know, it's a rare tourist attraction, but I doubt about it. So in a way, also the very outgrowing capital flight from Russia to Europe and extreme investments in real estate and other things makes Russian economy vulnerable and connected much more than it was in 2008 when we were talking about sanctions. So in a way, I think, of course, it's stick with two ends in a way.
Does anybody here know what a corporate raider is? Not raider, R-A-I-D-E-R, but R-E-I-D-E-R, a raider. Corporate raider. Jameson Firestone naturally knows, a few other people. So, you see, I don't think it's quite true that the contemporary Russian elite, the collective Putin, as it's often referred to in Russian politology, I don't think the collective Putin thinks in terms of the Cold War particularly. He doesn't want to build a huge Berlin Wall across the Dnieper. I don't think it thinks even in terms of spheres of influence particularly. It needs the spheres of influence to look big and strong. I think it's way, way more sophisticated than that. They basically talk about themselves as minority shareholders in globalization. But what they mean when they say minority shareholders is the Russian capitalist idea of minority shareholders, which is something called corporate raiding, R-E-I-D-I-N-G, who are sort of the ultra-violent cousins of corporate raiders. So this is how most Russian oligarchs made their money. You buy your way into a company, and then you arrest the other main shareholders, give the FSB money to come and arrest them so that you can take over the company and redo all the documents overnight, take out gunmen to shoot them. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, that company will be yours. That's pretty much, I think, how the collective Putin sees the global economy. You get inside, and then you take it hostage, and you mess with it. Because you can't do anything now because we're in the middle of it. I think it's a very postmodern 21st century, not Cold War, not 19th century view of geopolitics. So that's the thing about money. They always use that metaphor. I've heard it again and again.
And they think that way here. Here too. Here in when they buy companies in London, or when they.
Well, listen, there are lots of them, and I wouldn't sort of say, oh, they're all the same. There are plenty who would love Russia to be a sort of the great liberal democracy of the region that would sort of flourish. Plenty of them have understood that. They've understood that to really be successful, you actually have to be a sort of a benign force. But the collective Putin, which is this mix of corporate raiding and KGB-ness and paranoia, yes, that's the way they think about it, of course. And they think, but they think everyone's doing that. They always talk about the East India Company. You had the East India Company, now we're going to do it.
But they're calling it the West Europe Company.
How significant in Russian politics is that?
This is Sharon Tabari.
That will. Sorry, I'm Sharon Tabari, a journalist, and that will determine the future as well. And Putin going, this policy is going to stay. This mentality going to stay, because the problem that we see in Ukraine at the moment is a problem that exists with all the former Soviet republics, because of the population shift from Russia to those countries. I mean, I was reading about Tajikistan, for example, today, that they have raided the party office and accusing them that they want to do the same in Ukraine. So, I mean, how far? How is it the end of this thing? Is when Putin goes, this will end, or is it going to witness that for many years to come?
Well, this is the true clash of civilizations, I think, that might be underneath all of this. Is it going to be a benign economist version of corporate raiding, semi-benign, or is it going to be this sort of dark Putin version? I don't know which one's going to win. Sometimes I get up in the morning and I think it's going to be, the whole world is going to be flourishing. Next morning I go, oh my God, they're everywhere. I don't know. This is the great tension.
But what we can see is that corruption is eating away at the Russian economy and making it less and less competitive. And the break-even price, when Putin took office, $20 a barrel put money into the treasury. Now it needs to be around 100. And that is not because the costs of the oil industry have gone up worldwide. It's because Russia's become so corrupt that it just is eating more and more and more of the natural resource revenues that keep it going, and they fail to diversify. So I think the clock is ticking, but whether it's 5 months, 5 years, or 10, we don't know.
I'd like to use the last 20 minutes or so of the conversation to talk a little bit about what is the correct response. What should we here in London, we in the West, be thinking about Russia? What's the correct way? What's the correct reaction? Edward, I know that you were part of a Chatham House group, which perhaps you were part of as well, which has written a list of potential responses. Why don't you begin?
Yes. So this is the end of your papers. Is a Chatham House kind of list of things to do, and I think there's basically there is an assumption which I think is incorrect, but is sort of optimistic, which is that we can still put things back together again. Putin can put his toys back in the box, the troops go home or back into the Sevastopol naval base, and we can get back to business as usual. And it's therefore worth not doing anything irreversible now that will mean that Putin can't back down and we can get back to ignoring Ukraine and just having our nice, comfortable lives. I actually think that's wrong. I think what's happened is so dramatic that it's ended the post-1991 order. It's the end of the assumptions of the Paris Charter and all these other things that we thought were running European security. And we've actually got already to accept we're in a new world. If you take the optimistic assumption, then we should be talking about sanctions but not actually doing them in order to give Putin a chance to back down. I think that's wrong. I think we should be now going for visa sanctions straight away on all the people who are involved in this invasion of a sovereign country. That means all Duma members, all Federation Council members, people who work for the MOD, for the MVD, for the MHAS, all these power ministries and organs of power, and all their family members. Lavrov's daughter goes to LSE. Now, we may have to give Lavrov a visa. I'm very sorry for it, but we may have to give a visa to Lavrov every now and again to come to the West so we can talk to him. But I think that these visa sanctions send a very powerful message. America's already done it with the Magnitsky List. Shamefully, Europe hasn't. We can go. Something that Putin really minds about is the combination of visa sanctions and asset freezes, because it endangers the elite's ability to enjoy their ill-gotten gains. And what's the point of having ill-gotten gains if you can't enjoy them? I think all these diplomatic sanctions are all fine, G7 instead of G8, and cancelling sort of things. But I think the things that hurt are in the short term are these sanctions. And the great thing about them is they're extendable. We can start off with 1,000 people and say it's going to be 10,000 by the end of the year. And so it creates a kind of rolling squeeze on the regime. I also think we can do more on energy security. Already what the EU has done, something that probably the UKIPers don't notice, the EU is much more resilient than it was because it's got interconnectors, vital interconnectors being built. We're getting LNG in, we've got better storage. There's still more we can do on that. But I think we should be in a position where when we can, if Russia would turn off all the gas, we would have alternatives. So that's a kind of medium-term goal. I'll stop there because I think it'd be interesting to have some questions, but I commend this paper to you.
I'd also like to hear from Peter. You know how people think in Moscow. Are these things? Would this be useful or effective? These kinds of sanctions? Are they reasonable responses? Would they change the way you just spoke about 73% support for Putin? Does this change that? Does this change the nature of that regime, or is it or not?
Listen, sometimes you have to. Sometimes, especially in crisis moments, I think the most important thing is actually looking after your own kind of morality and sense of self, and not always trying to second guess. So I think what's most important, Putin's great argument is that the West is weak, the West is corrupt, and where we've bought our way into the systems, they won't do anything. So in that kind of, and Putin's high status is built on strength. It's not about nationalism or empire or whatever. It's just about being very big and strong. So if we're talking about what kind of impression being big and strong back to a culture that appreciates the big and the strong will probably make an impression. But I don't think it's really about that. I think it's about us and about us kind of cleaning up our own system and deciding to have a slightly different attitude towards the kind of capitalism we want. But also we have to remember, it's not only Putin who's started to think that we're a little bit pathetic. It's also Russian liberals and dissidents who've always looked to the West as a beacon. They don't anymore. They think, oh, the West, they're rubbish. They see themselves now in a very Moscow way as the last true liberals on earth, fighting the great sort of, the great enemy of freedom. And they think the West is that Putin's right about the West, that it's completely corrupt and soft. So there are some people who will respect us again, and there are other people, the large majority, who go, oh yeah, the EU, actually, they're pretty strong. Putin's not that big, so maybe his rating will go down. But we can't always second guess these things. They're a little bit, beyond us.
Just to jump in with one idea, because it's mentioned in the paper a bit, but I do think that EU should provide membership perspective to Ukraine with all the conditionality, because I think that it was very clear in terms of Ukrainians waving European flags, demanding European values and standards, being ready to die for this. Of course, it will depend if the new government will be able to deliver on these promises, put the act together under all the complexities of the situation that we've described. But I do believe that it would be a mistake not to offer in the near term membership perspective with conditionality.
Well, sorry, let's have a little quick round of questions before concluding. Dominic Lawson.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say one thing. I don't think that European standards of morality require you to be a member of the European Union. Okay, Ukraine can do that on its own. If it wants to, if it can. But the question, I mean, on Edward's point, I mean, one thing would be America has built up a massive glut of gas. It's illegal for American companies to export gas. Okay,
it's not strictly true.
Well, it is pretty much impossible. They need license, so that has to be liberated to create that effect. But just putting the point on, and I agree with you about visa restrictions. But say BP, which is probably the most significant company in the portfolio of every British pension fund. Okay, so we put in visa restrictions, and what you say happens. Putin says, "Oops, there goes 20% of your asset value in BP." Now, if you were the British government, not writing for The Economist, if you were the British government, if you were the British Chancellor, would you say, that's a price I'm prepared to pay?
Okay, hold that thought. Let me take two other. No, now everybody's raising their hands. Okay, let's take. Sorry.
We have Ian Bond.
Yeah, Ian Bond and one in the back. So you could first. So introduce yourselves.
Great, thank you. I'm Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I want to take two opposite ends of the spectrum, and the first is to go back to Peter's damaging memes, because it seems to me that they're quite important. There's a third one, which is that actually the revolution is dominated by fascists, and I wonder what can we do to counter the prevalence of those memes, particularly in the areas that are most influenced by the Russian-speaking media. I mean, I think it's good. I understand that that at least some of the Visegrad foreign ministers are going to eastern Ukraine. Carl Bildt is going to eastern Ukraine. That's great. But what else can we do concretely to counter the media war that's going on, the war of disinformation? And the second.
Other questions, particularly about this question of response, Western response.
Okay. Well, second quick question on Western response is. I know the Americans are sending 6 extra aircraft to join the NATO Baltic air policing. Is there anything else that people think we ought to be doing in the military field?
Yeah.
Right, I'm sure there is, right, okay.
Ewan.
Sorry.
Thanks very much. Dan Lewis from the Institute Directors and Future Energy Strategies. Given that the Ukraine has Europe's largest gas storage facilities of 33 BCM, 80% of which is in the West, and a significant shale gas reserve of its own, shouldn't the correct European response be much more to ramp up its own shale gas production with a specific aim of trying to decouple gas from oil prices, given that that has been so successful in America?
Yes. I'll take one more. Sorry, right there.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, intelligence analyst, basically a leukocyte, but also a BP shareholder. Dividend due 28th of March. Regarding the response, coming from essentially a leukocyte position of a hard line, because where are we going to be next, particularly in the Baltics if we don't? Are there any particular organizations which perhaps through the back door, either bilaterally from the West or ideally trilaterally with Ukraine, who could talk to Putin man to man, woman to woman, look in the eyes and say, look, you've gone too far, no more, and back.
I mean, somebody with Chechen bodyguards.
Not too hard talk.
Okay, there was one other question. I'll take that, and then we'll have some answers, and then wrap up.
Thank you. David Webster, the Indus Group. I wonder what, if anything, you would accept as legitimate Russian geopolitical interests in Ukraine. I mean, would you, for example, like to see a new Ukrainian government cancelling basing rights agreements?
What? Basing rights agreement. I'll let each of the three of you finish. You can pick up any of those points that you were particularly enraged by or interested by, and add anything else you'd like. Edward, why don't you go first?
What do you think Germany's geopolitical interests in the Netherlands are? Just to phrase the question like that already gives away. And I think it's fine to have military bases in other people's countries. We have American bases here. America has a base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. The question is what the underlying relationship is, but you've got to get away from this idea that just because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Empire, Russia has some kind of particular say there. So as soon as Russia starts talking about its geopolitical interests, I just reject that discourse altogether. On Dominic's point, it'll be much easier if we do this collectively. What Putin likes doing is picking off individual countries. And if we say, terribly sorry, this is EU sanctions, we're all doing it, it then is much harder for him to penalise one individual company, even one of BP's vulnerability. On Ian's point, information warfare is something the Russians have got very good at and we're crap at. And that's got to change. I was delighted, amazed and delighted to see the State Department produce a statement of 10 myths about Ukraine, which took me back to 1981 when they produced something on attacking the Warsaw Pact, the martial law in Poland. And it was 10 myths about martial law in Poland, rebutting the kind of Kremlin line on that.
I'd like to think that's because someone in the State Department had historical memory, but I can't believe that.
It was just fantastic. It's just fantastic. Just Google it. I tweeted it. I mean, you finally were getting into the business of saying, these are lies. There are no Nazis. Jews are not leaving Ukraine because they're scared. Jews are demanding the Russians get out of Crimea. But we need to have a much sharper tone in our information warfare to counter what they did. I also wonder whether how we should be dealing with Russia today. On the military side, absolutely, we need to do something very quickly right now to reassure what are effectively the frontline states. These are countries which have not spent much effort on territorial defence because they believe in NATO. So they don't have, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania do not have the ability to defend themselves because they've trusted us to defend them because they're part of NATO just as we're part of NATO. Please, let's not have any talk about will NATO defend the Baltics. The Baltics are NATO. But I would like to see, I mean, if it was me, I would send some patriots there. I think that would send a good message. On gas, I think that the shale would obviously be a good idea. It's not a panacea. It's actually, the most important thing right now is LNG. And we are already doing the right things on LNG, we just need to do it more quickly. Shale will be a game changer maybe in 5 to 10 years. And I will stop there.
Okay, Orysia.
Coming back to the question of the propaganda and the what can be done right now to stitch the country together in one information space. I mean, clearly we need more Russian-speaking content that addresses the fears and this propaganda that was coming back from Russia. I was looking at the statistics, and of course, along Ukraine, the people are more watching Ukrainian channels. The difference is in Crimea. So I think, using institutions like European Endowment for Democracy, which has been recently launched, finance internet websites, engage citizen journalism to help people create venues to report. And there's an interesting initiative called stopfake.org that is actually reporting the misinformation in the Western media and in Russian media, disclaiming in Russian, And yesterday I counted there were like 10 short stories about the outrageous lies that are being told on Russia Today and other Russian channels. And again, I want to come back to the beginning. This whole crisis started because Ukrainian people wanted to self-identify. They wanted to decide on what they want to be. And, Putin has pretty much, he has his interests, but, I don't think right now the West should talk above the head of Ukrainian foreign minister, Ukrainian prime minister. I understand they have to talk to Russia to try to mitigate the crisis. But this is what Russia wants. They want to discuss Ukraine's future without Ukraine. And I think this is very important for the West not to play for too long this game. I understand the immediate stage of the crisis. You have to talk to Lavrov and Putin. But Ukraine should be at the table as soon as possible because this is exactly the post-Cold War syndrome that Russia wants to impose on the West. And the West should deny this allegation.
Peter, you have the last word.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat what my fellow panelists said. If I hear this sphere of influence again, I'm actually, is it an oblong of influence?
Don't get radical.
Yeah, is it a rectangle of influence? Maybe it's a kind of a cylinder of influence. Or is it fractals of influence? Just this phrase just has to disappear. Russia can earn its sphere of influence if it becomes this beacon of progress in the region, and then Ukraine will pour towards it because the EU is rubbish. But it's failed in that. It has no sphere of influence. You earn a sphere of influence. You don't have it. I think we all agree on that. I just want to say it. They just have just that phrase. It's horrible. Conical sphere of influence. The disinformation thing, yes. Russia Today has to be, firstly we need, I don't know if it's think tanks, I don't know if this is a role for Radio Free Europe to take up. We were so good at propaganda war in the Cold War. We've completely given up on it. I think Masha Karp called it unilateral disarmament at one point. We've completely let our guard down. But that's the easy part. I mean, you just get a disinformation censor in a think tank. I think the Interpreter is trying to do this, or in something sort of state-funded. That's only half the problem. The other half of the people spreading memes are obviously all the lobbyists in the play of the Kremlin. That's, again, they're fairly easy. But there's also a whole think tank community, which is kind of like cunningly allied to the Kremlin and various structures. Am I going to get sued if I say Alexander Ra and a lot of other names of very respected Western intellectuals who are basically, I wouldn't say propagandists, I wouldn't say spin doctors, I'd call them courtiers of the Kremlin system. And they communicate, they message, they have very respected, very sensible, clever, wise pieces in the top broadsheets, and they're actually far more of a problem, I think, than RT, which is a huge problem, but actually quite easy to counter because you just do lie on lie. It's this more subtle kind of influences that I'm interested on.
Final thought.
Final thoughts. Well, let's look at the side positive effect of all of this. Is that the EU will kind of like find its meaning in life. Ukraine will have a coherent identity. And finally, we'll all realize that, America, can you come back now?
Okay, thank you very much.
America.
There are refreshments downstairs in the cafe below. Thank you. Thank you.